How's it going? SNH Performance again with another video. So have some schematics from some of Four Innovations fuel systems. So they make a good way to like go over the different, I guess this video is going to be about the different ways to plumb a return system. There's multiple ways: series, parallel, deadhead, regulator before, after, Ys, Ts, stuff like that. Oftentimes guys don't understand what's best for their setup. So I'll try to explain the basic ways and any pros and cons each way has. So what I have here is a very entry-level basic system. So Ford calls this level 1, their level 1 fuel system. It's using an OEM rail. So essentially you have your return hat, your feed has filtration, you have a 2-port regulator. When it says 2-port regulator, it means there's 2 pressure ports. Your pressure ports are on the side, your return ports on the bottom, back to the fuel tank. And so filtration, and then your feed comes into one of the pressure ports, and then the other pressure port dead ends in the rail. So this is also referred to as a bypass, since the regulator is pre-rail, or a deadhead setup is a common term used for this. Now this is like I said, this is basic budget level entry. What I mean by budget, this is the cheapest. I don't have to buy new rails. I use way less lines and fittings. This kit tends to run $300, $400, $500 cheaper than your next one. And your real limiting factor becomes the rail, the OEM rail system. And by that, I mean, you're limited by these stock sizes, whether it's 3/16, 3/8, or excuse me, 5/16, 3/8, anything like that. You're limited by that feed. Whereas like with an aftermarket rail, you could have a full AN half-inch port, 8 AN half-inch port to move fuel through the rails. All right. So pros of this system: it's cheap, it gets you quickly into a system, and it can actually support a lot of power. Because you're really, with the fuel pumps out there now, you can get a dual hat with 2 400 to 450 liter pair of pumps, and now you have a system that can easily support, pump-wise, 1,200 horsepower on gas, or like 1,000 on E85, right? Some of the cons of this is, like on a daily driver or street car, if you sit in a lot of stop and go traffic, you have a higher chance of having vapor lock in the rail on a really hot day. If you're sitting still, idling, low load, lots of heat in the engine bay, not a lot of air moving through, because this pressure here is dead ending and you have very little flow, right? So there's some physics stuff going on here, right? So to prevent the gas from vaporizing in the rail, it's under pressure. Normally about a 40 pound PSI is pressure. Pressure is good for all situations to not affect, or not to let vapor happen in the rails from heat. So what happens? Say I have 2 400 liter power pumps in there. They're both running full on for a total of 800 liters per hour. So my system has full flow here, a little bit less here, returning, but still a lot, and very slow moving fuel here at idle. I'm talking low load, right? High RPM, lots of fuel is being sent here. All the vapor is going to come out if you were idling for like 30 minutes, right? And you got some vapor buildup. Right, because the gas is moving slow here. It's dead ending in the rails, so the flow here is slower because the injectors are not dumping a lot of fuel at idle, right? The injectors have a higher pulse width, they're open longer, they're injecting more fuel is being fed to the rails and less is being returned. So could be a pro, or sorry, a con. So it depends on what you want to do with your car. There's a couple ways to solve that. One, the better you can cool your engine bay and keep your rails cool. E85 tends not to have that problem, just because E85 in the rail actually lowers rail temperature quite a bit compared to gas. If you have a PD blower or twin screw, you know, something putting more heat in the engine bay, right? You can vent. All the normal stuff applies to keeping your engine bay cool to prevent vaporization. Another trick is to run a higher base pressure. So if it is a street car and you know you're gonna, when you drive to and from work, if it's a daily, like, hey, I got 20 minutes of stop and go traffic on the way to work, I think I might have to worry about this problem. You can raise your base pressure, right? So some more physics. When you pressurize a fluid, you raise the boiling temperature. So, you know, you could raise your base pressure from 40 to 50 pounds or something like that. And then you can test the car and see if that, all right, I'm not getting vapor. I'm not seeing a pressure loss in the rail when vapor is created. That's the most common way to see. All right, but that's enough of that. So level 1 4 kit, a budget entry level, similar to the kits I do where with the 4 stuff where you're just feeding stock rails. Yeah, I mean, this is the easiest way to get you into a return system, and it's still very capable, and it's also upgradable. So you can start with this and then later decide to get aftermarket rails, split out feeds, move the regulator to after your aftermarket rails. So now you're getting flow through the rails, then pressure regulation, then return, which I'll get to in a minute. So, all right. Next, what Ford calls is a level 2. The common way this is referred to is rails in series. And then you can see your regulator here is after the rails. One of the side ports is not being used on the 2-port regulator. So again, feed filtration. It's coming into one of the rails. In this case, it's coming into the driver's side rail. Your driver to passenger rail has a crossover line. And then the other end of your system is your feed over to the regulator. And then your return back to the tank. So this is what Ford calls level 2 again. And the term most people refer to this is rails in series, a series system, regulators after the rails, right? So there's a lot of misconceptions about the capability of this kit, which I'll get into in a little bit. There's really no limitation to a kit like this other than like when 8A inline fitting and sizes become a limitation. So if you saw a problem where an in-series rails caused a potential high RPM, high load, high pressure problem, it's because your flow capacity of your fuel system is exceeding the line and rail capability. And I'll get into that here in a little bit. So, people think, the biggest thing people like to think about this is pressure drop. They think I'm going to have a big, right? So my fuel's coming in here, through here, and up to here. So pressure is being maintained from here and is being maintained in this whole feed line back to the outlet of the fuel pump. So let's think about the physics of it for like a flow loss or, you know, pressure loss from flow restriction. So common line sizes, easy to remember, flow loss when you're plumbing or planning. 6A in 6 feet, 8A in 8 feet, 10A in 10 feet. It's a good rule of thumb for when you're measuring lines and building your system on your car for your application. And what does that mean? So every 6 feet of 6A in line will have 1 PSI pressure loss from friction. 8A in every 8 feet and 10A in every 10 feet. All right, so if I'm measuring pressure back from the regulator, and let's say I put my regulator, you know, I've seen some people mount it close to the rail exit. I mean, you can feed in the back, cross over in the front. There's many ways to do this basic concept. But let's say I have my regulator about here back by the firewall, and I have about, I don't know, 2 feet of line running to here. The rail's about 1 foot long. There's 3 feet. Crossover is about 1 foot. Other rail is 1 foot. And then that's really where you have to stop measuring. I don't care about this 10 feet back to here because pressure is being maintained this and working its way back, right? And then you have a little bit of higher pressure here, but that's just because it's overcoming the filter to get it up to here to maintain it. So what do I mean by that? So let's say we had 2 feet of line here, 3, 4, 5. So potentially I have a max of, in this scenario we're talking about, a max of 5 feet of 8AN line. So we're talking, you know, 3/4 of a PSI loss tops from here to where it entered the rail. Okay. Which is not very significant if you think about it. And now let's take it a step further. And where does pressure consistency matter? It matters for injector fuel delivery. So let's go from the front of here, where you have, you know, 8 injectors, your injector here closest to the regulator, and your injector here furthest from the regulator. What do we have? 2.5, 3 feet tops, right? So realistically, it's about 10 inches back from that injector. This line is under a foot, depending on how you routed it. I mean, you could bow it up or down or go straight across, but either way, it's under a foot. And then under a foot to here. So let's just say 3 feet max between the first and last injector in this flow path. 3 feet. We're talking 1/4 of a PSI pressure loss max, and that's for friction loss going through angled fittings and line, right? Because some say in series, a series return system, you have to worry about that. You would have to try to create that problem. It's actually very hard in any normal series setup, unless like I was like, hey, I'm gonna put my regulator in the trunk and route like a 15-foot line back to it. That's probably not a good idea. So don't do that. And another pro of this, compared to what we're going to talk about, where it's called rails in parallel, where we have a split feed. I'll get into that in a minute. But the real pro of this is the whole series thing. You have 100% of your fuel flow going through both rails available to all 8 injectors. Whereas if your rails are split, you have a Y or a T fitting, and each rail is splitting the feed from the pump, each bank is only getting half the overall flow capability of your fuel system. And yes, it's split, but there's also 4 injectors on each bank. I get that. But if you're going to talk about from a stable like pressure and flow standpoint, with that small of a log in series, I mean, it might as well just be one rail with, you know, 8 injectors on it, one straight rail. There's really no difference. And how would you plummet that? If you had a straight 8 engine where it didn't have 2 rails, it had 1 rail, 8 injectors in a row, then am I still in series? All right. It's just kind of a problem that came up because of the fact you have 2 rails. So we came up new ways to solve the problem. I hope that makes sense if you're still following. So this kit, super capable. I'm not going to put a horsepower limit on it. The horsepower limit is based on the flow of the system and the line size. At some point, which is typically around 1,000 liter per hour of flow, the line itself will start becoming a restriction because you're moving so much fluid that you need to step up to a larger size. All right, so that would mean like if I was running a triple pump, an 8AN series system would probably not be my best bet. But everything under that, if I'm just running a dual pump, or even if you're running a triple and you're really only running 1,000, 1,200, 1,300 horsepower, because that third pump is just like a boost only pump or only comes on temporarily when needed under high RPM, high boost, high load, this would still, 8AN series would still be fine. So rails being in series is not a downfall at all. It works perfectly fine. Again, this is a cheaper kit because it's less plumbing. You don't need Ys, Ts, more fittings, more hose. And it's super capable. 80 to 90% of the fuel systems I end up selling, people run rails in series. It's closer to OEM with a crossover. It's easy to plumb, easier to manage where everything is. Super popular, super capable. Can't go wrong with it. All right. And then L3 here is what I was talking about, rails in parallel. And there's 2 different ways to do it. This one in particular is pre-regulated or also deadhead parallel. So there's two types of parallel. One where your feed comes in. Let's see if I even got. Yeah, we'll go with that one. We'll finish up with those, but in this case, you have a Y block in each rail, so you're splitting your full flow potential. And when I'm talking about flow is what makes the power. You need mass. You need a specific amount of fuel to mix with the air in the cylinder to make the horsepower level. So volume or fuel mass getting from the tank to the rail is what you need to support horsepower. So when I put a horsepower limit on something, it's based on how much fuel I can get from my fuel tank to my rail available to my injector. And when I'm talking about what an injector can deliver, it's based on pressure. The higher the pressure in the rail, the more the injector will give at each pulse. And when there's not enough volume in the rail, i.e. the injector opens and shuts, and it was open long enough and wanted so much fuel at the pressure that's in there that it actually drained the rail and created space and caused a pressure drop. So that's why the common time when you see I'm out of fuel pump, at high RPM, high boost, you're going to see a pressure drop in your rail because the injectors are putting more fuel into your combustion chambers than that the system can maintain in there. So in an ideal world, you need enough pump that under all load, all boost, high RPM situations, the injectors can't take more because it's controlled. The injectors are controlled leak. You don't want your injectors taking away more fuel from the rail than what your pumps can supply. This is the basics of it. Hence why you always hear like, you can never have enough pump. Safety, right? So that's a Y block. I'll actually probably talk about this first before I go to this bypass deadhead 4-port regulator setup. So Ford calls this a level 4 system. Excuse me. All right, so I have my feed. Like I was talking about, I have a Y block. You can wear a Y or a T. People will argue that from a physics standpoint, a Y block flows better and creates less pressure loss than a T fitting, which in your mind, like, yeah, I just don't have any data to prove that. Ford prefers Ys. If you like Ys, go with Ys. If you like a T, run a T. I've seen people run both. I've never seen a problem develop because you ran a Y or a T fitting to split your fuel. And why is that? I mean, what is a T fitting at the end of the day? It's a 90-degree fitting. And I guarantee you're running 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 90-degree fittings on your fuel system already. All right? I got 90s here. I got 90s coming in on my rail. I got 90s over here at this regulator. So if I had a T fitting, all a T fitting is 2 90-degree fittings. But instead of it only having one way for the fuel to go, now it has each branch of the T. So it has 2 90s. So now the fuel can choose to go either direction. All right. One of the cons of this parallel setup, right? So I already talked about how now each rail, you've created a split bank system. Now, say we had 2 400-liter pumps again. Now each rail is only getting half that. Maybe. What do I mean by maybe? In a perfect world, maybe each rail has the same amount of volume. But in realistic application, does it? Like in series, I'm forcing 100% of my fuel through each rail. And like we talked about, we have 1/4 to 1/2 a PSI pressure loss between one injector and the other one, max. So, like if I'm thinking about an injector giving fuel, if one had a 0.25 PSI back pressure difference for pulsing, how much mass is that? Now you could do a test. I mean, I don't have any data off the top of my head. If I wanted to, I could run an injector on my flow machine, run it at 40 PSI and check the flow, and then run it at 40.25 PSI and check the flow. And see what percentage of difference of flow rate I got based on that 1/4 PSI difference. But now we're talking about overall flow available. So what you got to worry about is your plumbing constraints in your engine bay for your power out application in your setup. Because what I have to be careful about in a split bank parallel setup to try and make both banks have the same amount of flow as possible is these line links from the split and going to my regulator need to be as identical as possible. Can I always do that? No. Is there any application where someone nailed that perfectly? Like I have the exact same bends and the exact same line links? It's practically not possible in an engine bay. Now, if you set up like a test bench to test this and everything was straight, my Y then came out and I had the lines going straight into the rails, straight to the regulator, and I just kept everything perfect, I would probably see the most minimum difference in flow between the two rails. But I don't know, is there a slight machining? You know, like you have a better chance of getting uneven banks in parallel. And I'm over exaggerating, guys. This is also not going to be a problem as long as you have enough pump flow. That would only show its problem if I did not have enough flow for what my injectors were pulsing. So now what would happen in that scenario compared to series is a whole bank would get starved before the other one. So if you had your pressure gauge, depending on where it was, you may not be seeing it. You know what I mean? So like, say because of line links, we had a 10% difference in flow. Is that a lot? I don't know, like 40, 50 liters per hour on a big system like that. It could be if you were taxing your system. Realistically, if you have enough pump, it shouldn't. But it's just something to think about. Like, none of these methods are really hard in stone, like thou shalt do it this way. I mean, this information is just for you to get more informed of how it all works and pick what setup works best for your car, right? So you have half the flow in your split bank system. In this case, again, 2-port regulator, one wide out. Each rail is pressure maintained in its loop, right? So I have a set pressure to get through the rail and up to my Y. And then now I have pressure and flow split and being regulated on both sides of the thing. So realistically, when you get this on your car, you're gonna have a difference between banks. Is it a pound and 40 liters per hour? I don't know, that depends on how you do it. But when you plumb it, you wanna be careful to make sure there's not a mismatch in overall link between your split and your up to your pressure. You want each complete loop to be as equal distant as possible to minimize pressure and flow differences in your banks. That makes sense? Pretty straightforward. So when you plan it out, all right, if my regulator is going to be on one side of the engine bay or the other, I know if it's over on my passenger side that this line's going to be shorter. Maybe I route it around to the far side of the regulator to try to compensate. You know what I mean? Or my Y is somewhere back here. I route one line up and over to the front and the other one around in the back with a 180 to try to make them the same length, if that makes sense. And these kits are more expensive. You're using more line. There's more line in the kit that drives the price up. You know, you have more fittings because you're plumbing in and out of both rails. You're using all the ports. You have to plumb up a Y plus pay for a Y or a T. So yeah, so that is a split bank parallel setup. Regulator after rails, also capable of big power. I would tell you the only thing, if I was going to pick this over series, I would take extra care to make the banks as close to each other as possible, and then I would make sure I had a little more pump than what I could handle. So like, if I go to this other one, this is another common one. Where it's coming through the regulator before the rails. Or, excuse me. No, it's the same setup. It's just on a different car. It's both L4. Oh, I need the L3 one. So these are both L4s. The difference is this L3, which is a parallel deadhead regulator before setup. So, and this setup, it's literally just like series, except now I split the banks because I have 2 rails. If I didn't have 2 rails on the car, this method wouldn't be possible. So what do guys with big horsepower straight 6s do? Oh, they can't do parallel, huh? But a lot of people think automatically I'm getting better performance or flow because I'm splitting the banks. Not necessarily true. All right? And then this is what they call a level 3. it's also a deadhead setup. So this is very similar to what the a few years now, the last Coyote supercharged Cobra Jet platform was running. So the Ford Cobra Jet was running a setup like this. This is what most people commonly think of when they think of a high performance deadhead or bypass setup. So unlike the level 1 kit we just looked at the very beginning, where I have a 2-port regulator pre-rails and I'm dead ending in stock rails, right? So now this kit is like this basic budget setup on steroids, right? So it has more performance because of the way it's set up. So pros of this. Each rail has a dedicated feed from the regulator. I really like that. If I was going to do a dual bank setup, I like this better than a Y or a T and trying to keep those long 5 to 6 foot or more links as close as possible. This is much easier to do it on this. All right. And each rail is going right over to your regulation point where your pressure is being maintained. So you could even hide this in the valley back behind or under the intake or back on the firewall above the transmission or whatever. You can put it off to one side. You just want to make sure these links from each pressure port are as close as possible. Same concept, just a little easier to do on this. This setup is often a necessity for blower applications like PD twin screw blower, where you don't have a lot of room at the front or the back of the rails, right? Because you often have big intake elbows, bracketry, alternator, a bypass valve on the back on one side that like makes it hard to plumb in and out of both rails. So a lot of big power PD blower guys, or like I said, the Cobra Jet had a fuel system like this, will want to go this route. This is the common one I push guys for big power on an application like that where they don't have access to the rails. But it's also a very capable system. Again, it is deadhead, so you have to worry about vapor lock. So consider the stuff I talked about earlier. There are ways around that. But you also get this badass 4-port regulator. And what's better about this, now granted you can upgrade one of the other kits to a 4-port. The biggest thing is it has 2 8AN ports and 2 10AN ports. So now, if I am running that triple pump, I can do a full 10AN feed into my regulator and then a dual 8AN split to my 8AN rails, which is physics-wise a great way to do it. So now I'm regulating and the splitting in the geometry of the regulator instead of running a Y or a T. Or I mean, you can do 8. Like it's got options. This regulator is a little more expensive, but it's actually a great regulator. You can upgrade to it on any of the kits, but in this application for big power, it's a mandatory. So that's what they put in it. But yeah, so in this case, I had the feeds coming down through the filter, coming into one of the ports if it's 8AN or 10AN, and then yeah, it's 2 8AN, 2 10AN, but like, yeah, the rails are 8AN. Oh, I got to run 10. No, you can step to 8 or 10. Like, it's very configurable for your setup. So that's 4 to 5 basic ways to do a return system. You know, those are the mainstream ones. So hopefully that gives you information. If you have any questions, I know this video is getting a little bit long, but I could talk all day about this. There's a lot to know, and I do field a lot of questions about this, especially when guys are like, hey, I need to switch to return. I'm on 85. I'm maxing out my dual BAP, Deechworks, pump. Like, they've fully upgraded their returnless system, and it's not cutting it just because the flow of ethanol is so much greater than gasoline. It's hard to keep up, right? And they go return like, oh, I don't know crap about a return system. So hopefully that gives you some more information. Like I said, if you have questions about this, I have a lot of experience with these systems, just drop them in the comments. That's it. Hope that sheds some light on different ways to plumb a return fuel system for your car. All right.